Nous avons deux défis pour ce panel. Un premier défi qui est, nous avons un format décentralisé, mais bon, ça tombe bien, parce que c'est quand même l'univers dans lequel on opère aujourd'hui, avec une présence en ligne d'une assistante parlementaire à Bruxelles. J'espère qu'elle pourra nous rejoindre. Et, je vois, non, pas encore, bon, c'est vrai qu'il y a les écrans là. En espérant qu'elle nous rejoigne bientôt. Un défi de langue. Nous allons alterner entre la langue de Molière et la langue de Shakespeare. Merci d'avance aux traducteurs. Alors je voulais juste pour set the scene un petit peu, pour commencer cette discussion, rappeler les énormes avancées historiques, on peut dire le terme, que l'Europe a vraiment fait ces dernières années pour ce qui est de la création d'un marché unique du numérique en Europe. On a évidemment, vous le savez dans cette salle, le premier cadre européen sur la réglementation des cryptos, MiCA. On a la réglementation des plateformes avec le Digital Services Act, le Digital Markets Act. On a la mise en place d'un espace européen de la donnée, un marché unique de la donnée avec le Data Act et ses déclinaisons sectorielles qui sont en train d'arriver. Et sans oublier évidemment l'acte sur la loi sur l'intelligence artificielle dont un accord est attendu dans les mois prochains. Je vois que Angelica nous a rejoint et puisque nous allons traiter de l'avenir de la donnée dans un environnement Web3, je pensais important de s'arrêter dans un premier temps sur l'acte sur les données numériques. Et je me tourne donc vers Angelica, and I switch to English. Angelica, very warm welcome, and it's an honor to have you. You are the assistant to MEP Mitunu, who has been a shadow rapporteur for the group Renaissance, Renew, on the Data Act. In fact, I think in 3 minutes, the Parliament will be voting on the Data Act, so it's very, very timely. And assuming it goes through, it would be really good to hear from you for a few minutes, you know, what the Data Act actually does and why it matters to people in this room. And then we'll have a short conversation among the panelists. So over to you, Angelica.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of a panel, even if remotely. But thanks to technologies, this is something that we can do nowadays. You were rightly mentioning the Data Act is going to be voted in 4 minutes from now in the ITRE committee. It's the main committee responsible for the file in the Parliament. And there will be another vote in November. So pending these 2 votes, the Data Act will become legislation very soon, and we will be really close to creating a data market in the European Union. But to maybe take a step back a little bit to explain about what the Data Act is and what it does, and why it's indeed important for the European Union, but not only, maybe to every one of us, everyone sitting in the room. So the idea of the Data Act is that it is actually one piece of a bigger puzzle. The European Union has presented recently, and you mentioned it as well, quite a lot of proposals related to the digital field. We have a Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, Artificial Intelligence, which is now also on the table. We have the Digital Governance Act, the Data Governance Act, and now the Data Act is supposed to be one final piece of legislation that connects all of these dots together and establishes rules on what type of data can be shared, how do we share this data, and who can share this data. So these rules are important for, first of all, for the EU overall, because it will bring a lot of revenues and embedded value. It is estimated now that it can bring up to 270 billion in terms of revenues to the EU GDP. Also, when we talk about companies or businesses more broadly, the more they invest and the more they focus their business around data innovation, the higher the productivity is. And there are different statistics across the market, but I think the the main data that we're now having is that it can boost the productivity of a company by between 10 and 20% just by the simple fact that they use data-driven innovation. So to dive maybe a little bit deeper into what exactly it is and what are these rules that we're all talking about. So the Data Act is mainly focused around the data that comes from IoT devices. We're talking, this is horizontal legislation, we're talking about data stemming from devices like smart bulbs and vacuum cleaners, everything up to airplane engines, cars, and very sophisticated industrial machines. So the data that is currently collected by all of these devices is mostly owned, if we can use the word owned, by the manufacturer. We as users of these devices, but also our companies barely have any access to this data. And that's why Data Act comes as a piece of legislation that has been called both revolutionary, but also innovative, disruptive in the same time. So we heard a lot of different words attributed to this legislation, but the main added value is that it really shifts the paradigm of who is entitled to have access to this data. So from now on, it will not be only the manufacturer of a device, but it will also be the user. So the first thing is that we will have the first added value, or the first key element is that we will have increased transparency, and we will finally allow users to gain access to all the data that is being collected. So each one of you in this room that are having some sort of smart device, you will be able to receive all the data from the manufacturer. Of course, provided that we are in a way protecting the trade secrets of the companies and also security of devices. So there are a couple of limits, but the idea is that most of the data that comes in raw format, so data that is minimally processed, would be data that would be made available to the users. From here on, the user will have control over the data and also the possibility to further share it with maybe other parties, other companies, in order to receive certain services for the devices. So if you think of a smart car, you would not be bound by the manufacturer that is selling you the car to go there in order to receive a service, but the users will be able to go anywhere they want to any potential provider of a repairing shop or maybe maintenance service, and provide them the data that they need for doing the repair or the maintenance. So this is one of the bigger elements of the proposal, is that the user is really at the center of this whole data market and the whole data economy. On top of that, we have a second element, which is allowing the possibility to share data among businesses. So we have a business to consumer component, and then we have this business to business component. And it would be a possibility for companies to share data among them and to really harness and leverage this data in order to create better services. And then we have a final element, which is the business to government side. It is a new addition that comes as a result of a pandemic. It has shown us that the governments did really benefit from the data that was out there on the market in order to be more efficient in replying to these emergency situations. So we want also to empower governments to be to have data-based decisions so they can be a bit more efficient. Of course, this is a scenario that has a lot of limits because we don't want to have abuses of data, and is mainly surrounded around the concept of replying to emergencies. So in those cases, governments or public authorities would be able to request certain types of data from the businesses and the companies in order to provide better services to their citizens or responses to these emergency situations. So in short, this is what Data Act does. It's again built upon the idea that we are trying to provide more control of the data to the users. this is also maybe touching upon a little bit the idea of smart contracts. That is also part of a proposal. I think we can discuss this a bit at a later stage, but I can shortly mention that one way in which the data is going to be shared, it would be through automated, through contracts that are automatically executed. We have used the term smart contracts in this proposal, but it's a much broader term. It would rather, it should rather be interpreted as a digital contract than a smart contract in a way in which it is introduced in this proposal. So again, the Data Act has introduced a lot of new ideas. It's probably the EU is a pioneer in this area in legislating data, because there are not, currently there are no other countries that are really having a harmonized approach in terms of how data is being shared, with whom is being shared, and under what conditions. And with that, I think I will stop here for now, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Angelica. We'll come back to you, and if you obviously get the results of the vote before the end of this panel, please let us know.
Of course.
You mentioned, smart contracts. Clearly, you have been, like many other MEPs and policymakers, at the receiving end of a Web3 campaign around concerns that some of the, the definition, the limitations also imposed on the use of smart contracts, the controls that were required would be incompatible with how smart contracts are used and deployed on, for the Web3 environment. So if I heard you, you're able to reassure everyone in this room that there was no intention whatsoever to regulate the broader, Web3 ecosystem through that smart contract provision in particular.
Yeah, I can maybe reply to this quickly now. So the main idea was by no means to touch upon or regulating smart contracts in general. This inclusion of smart contracts in the Data Act is really limited to data sharings that are being done in the framework of this legislation. Now, what we have provided as well is a definition of smart contracts, which is again very limited to data transfers that are being done from one company to another or one party to another. And this is not limited to blockchain or ledger technology. It's really a very broad term that can be interpreted to include any other type of technology that is used to perform these data transfers. There's just a couple of elements that need to be met in order for a transfer to this automated transfer to be qualified as a so-called smart contract in the context of Data Act, and this is the fact that it needs to have an automated execution. It needs to have needs to be a sequence of this a sequence that is ensuring the integrity of the data, and finally it has to be in chronological order. So I would leave it to your discretion to interpret it, but after the vote, and I'm sure the text is already out there in the public, it's indeed something that is much broader than trying to regulate Web3 or trying to regulate any particular piece of technology that is now already being used.
Thank you very much, Angelica. Maybe Nadia, je me tourne vers vous, peut-être avec peut-être plus la casquette INAPTA et votre rôle de leadership au sein de cette association européenne. Vous avez suivi ce débat. Est-ce que vous souhaitez commenter par rapport à l'impact potentiel de cette nouvelle loi sur le développement du Web3 ?
Merci Bertrand, bonjour à tous. Oui, effectivement, INADBA, qui est International Association for Trusted Blockchain Application, a publié une lettre sur ce sujet avec d'autres, dont vous, il me semble, Bertrand. Et je pense que c'est important de comprendre qu'à un moment donné, quand on introduit le sujet et qu'on indique qu'on va appliquer un certain nombre de règles sur ce que nous, on a compris comme étant notamment les smart contracts, y compris en blockchain public, ça nous semble important de répondre à ce point-là et de faire des propositions, et c'est ce qu'on a fait avec une idée à la base qui est assez simple, hein, en tout cas pour Inadba, c'est qu'on prône plutôt le développement des technologies du Web3 dans un écosystème qu'on aimerait le plus ouvert possible, le plus neutre et le plus agnostique possible en termes de technologie. Et il faut qu'on puisse garder ça et qu'on puisse garder aussi une certaine souplesse et une adaptabilité des réglementations, parce que tout n'est pas complètement sec, même si ça fait plusieurs années qu'on avance sur ces sujets-là. Et également, il ne faudra pas qu'il y ait une réglementation qui vienne couper ou casser un élan qui existe déjà dans ce domaine, et y compris dans des sujets sur lesquels on va parler plus tard, sur les sujets d'identité. Donc ça, c'est important pour nous, d'où également la proposition effectivement de faire passer le terme smart contract en termes digital contract, de aussi arriver à passer la régulation peut-être plus sur un environnement qui est maîtrisable, notamment sur les blockchains permissionnées ou privées, plutôt que sur les blockchains publiques, parce que ça va être compliqué d'appliquer ce qui est prévu. Voilà, donc pour nous, c'est assez important d'arriver à faire attention de conserver un dialogue, même si je comprends que les discussions sont arrivées tard dans le débat. Mais il y a quand même un enjeu, et le Data Act est pour nous extrêmement important. Alors, pas uniquement côté Inadba, mais côté Caisse des dépôts, et notamment sur la souveraineté des données en Europe, etc. C'est quelque chose qu'on suit et qui fait partie de nos objectifs majeurs. Donc, ça, c'est important. Il faut qu'on traite ce sujet-là. Mais en revanche, il faut aussi qu'on fasse attention à ne pas limiter l'innovation sur les sujets Web3 via ce Data Act. Voilà.
Alors, je rebondis sur la souveraineté. Ça me permet aussi to move to Ren. Ren, we'll talk about some of the business solutions you're bringing together with others in a second. But you are based in the US. You're hearing about all this sort of major advances that Europe is bringing, including on the Data Act. What's your perspective from sitting in Brooklyn as to, is Europe going crazy? Is this potentially, are we seeing future international standards here? How are you looking at this from a US perspective?
Thank you very much. And first of all, pardon, je parle un peu français, mais français embarrassement. Alors, avec votre permission, I will switch to English, but thank you very much for having us at Dan. What a wonderful event, and what exciting things are happening in Europe, and specifically in France. And thank you, Bertie, first of all, for pronouncing my name so well. My name is Chen Arad. I'm from Israel. We have those biblical sounds in our language. And second, for being accurate and saying that I'm from Brooklyn, not New York, which people in New York are very particular about. I will say two things. Obviously, any legislation coming from Europe is interesting, first of all, because it's Europe. Second of all, from the context of Web3 and crypto and DeFi, such a globalized industry, cross-border regulation that is effective is really interesting. I will say two quick comments, one professional, one personal. On a professional level, obviously, there are big challenges when it comes to unified regulation in the United States, specifically on data. Still very much state by state versus federal, and I think it's in a lot of ways it's an interesting inspiration and kind of model, and you see that also in how, in some ways, Congress and Capitol Hill looks at MiCA, which we'll get to. On a personal level, I just have to say, as an example, that when Threads, the new Meta app, was released a week and a half ago, I immediately downloaded it like everyone, just to discover the next day, because of a lot of media about it, that the amount of data that they're collecting was disturbing to me personally. I have a feeling that if I was based in Europe, it would have been easier for me to find that out earlier. So I think it's a very, very interesting approach, and I really look forward to seeing how it's ratified and evolved.
Right, let's move. I mean, we've heard about how Europe is on a mission to unleash the power of data, including personal data. We know how the system currently operates to kind of accumulate the information on existing very large platforms and not necessarily European ones. So I think we heard about retaining, indeed regaining control for the data subjects. Hadrien and Florian and Nadia, I would love to hear, all your organizations are developing Web3-based private sector solutions to help manage identity online. Starting with Hadrien. Hadrien, I think you're French, but you want to speak English, and that's fine as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about SISMO, what you're doing, and how that's helping with this?
Merci beaucoup, Bertrand. Donc c'est pour respecter la langue de Molière que je vais parler en anglais. But yeah, actually I won't speak that much about SISMO. I'd like to speak a bit about cryptography and the benefits that it brings. I think that the first breakthrough are digital signatures. That's what you have in your passport chip. When you go to the border, they check the signature of the government and they say, okay, you have a valid passport. That's what we use in Bitcoin, in blockchains. It allows us to prove, okay, the origin of this message is that account, that Bitcoin account, that passport, or that Web3 account. And we're working on a new breakthrough that has happened the past 10 years, is zero knowledge proofs. And this time, from a message, you are able to selectively disclose some data about it. So let's imagine that we have a digitalized passport that is then you have a cryptographic proof that you own a passport with some fields, let's say your age, your nationality, when it was delivered, while the digital signature enables you to prove, hey, this passport was issued by the French government. The zero knowledge proof that we are working on enable you to say, I have a passport that was issued by the French government, and I can reveal to you that I'm older than 18 without revealing anything more. So that's another big breakthrough that is big in our Web3 world. It involves many things, but regarding the sovereignty of users, it's very, very powerful, because once we brought ownership of data to users, now with these technologies, they have the tool to share exactly what they consent to applications. So instead of having to upload your passport everywhere for no reason and giving your face, your name, your first name, your exact age, you'll be able to pick exactly what you want to reveal. So that's what we are working on. And we're really looking forward to have more and more sovereign data, because once it's sovereign, when it's controlled by private keys, then you can use this very, very powerful technology.
Okay, well, let's do a tour, and then we'll come back maybe to a few questions. Florian, as CEO of two companies involved in, again, digital identity protocols, en français, zut, oui, c'est pas grave. Oui, parlez-nous un petit peu de ce que vous apportez aussi comme solution sur ces vérifications d'identité.
Ouais, bah déjà pour tous ceux qui n'auront pas complètement compris ce qu'Hadrien dit en anglais, moi je vais le redire en français comme ça. Non, nous on a commencé avec le constat de dire que la data, pour qu'elle ait de la valeur, il faut qu'on puisse lui faire confiance. Donc il faut qu'on puisse être sûr de la source. Si je suis capable de faire des faux documents d'identité, bah en fait toute la chaîne de valeur qui va avoir lieu derrière n'a finalement aucun sens. Donc on a commencé nous à construire un Synaps, qui est une solution de vérification d'identité, que ce soit pour des individus ou pour des entreprises. Et ensuite on a créé Anima, qui est notre protocole d'identité décentralisé. Sur Synaps, bah, comme ce que Hadrien expliquait, nous aujourd'hui on a la capacité de vérifier qu'un document, grâce à un document biométrique, on a une signature d'un gouvernement qui vient nous donner des informations. Donc en fait, on a de la data, on a par exemple le visage de la personne, son nom, son prénom, sa date de naissance, sa nationalité. Toutes ces informations-là, en fait, c'est comme si c'était un gouvernement qui venait nous dire, voilà, cette data, vous pouvez la truster, c'est moi qui vous dis que le document est authentique. Donc une fois qu'on a fait cette vérification et qu'on est vraiment sûr que la data est bonne, bah, l'utilisateur a la possibilité de la décentraliser. Donc là, il va pouvoir signer un message avec son wallet. Et après, donc en signant un message, il vient la chiffrer. Comme c'est chiffré avec son wallet, il n'y a que lui qui est capable ensuite d'accéder à cette data. Et on va la stocker sur un decentralized data storage. Voilà. Et donc peut-être, bah, aujourd'hui, on a, pour faire un peu de promo, non, on a accompagné un peu plus de 600 projets dans les cryptos. Donc on a aidé à lever un peu plus de 5 milliards de dollars. Et aujourd'hui, on a des acteurs comme Polygon, Starknet, The Sandbox, Signum, une banque suisse crypto-friendly, Jump Trading, le plus gros market maker qui nous utilise.
Ok, merci Florian. Nadia, vous aussi, vous travaillez, je crois, en étroite collaboration avec certains de vos clients pour les aider sur ces sujets.
Alors, même on a la Caisse des dépôts, la Poste, EDF et Engie ont créé Archipel en 2020, qui est une structure qui travaille, qui est une société qui travaille sur 3 offres aujourd'hui. Verify, Certify et Connect, et qui développe une offre qui permet à la fois de traiter des credentials et de la DID. On vient de faire une augmentation de capital et de faire entrer IN Group aussi, qui est un gros... Alors, IN Group, pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas, c'est à la base l'imprimerie nationale, mais c'est un très grand acteur de l'identité numérique, pas uniquement en France. Et écoutez, la Poste, il y a Doca Post aussi qui est un acteur de la confiance numérique et de l'identité numérique qui est assez important. Donc, on travaille à la fois... alors, c'est plutôt en B2B pour le coup, et on travaille sur l'identité des individus et des entreprises. Archipel a eu la chance d'être retenu dans 3 des consortiums qui ont répondu à l'appel d'offres européen sur... La mise en place du e-wallet européen et de ses usages, notamment en lien avec l'EPSI, donc, dont un qui a été annoncé récemment par le ministre du Numérique et de l'Intérieur, qui est le consortium Potential, qui était celui qui avait été présenté par la France et l'Allemagne notamment. Donc c'est plus qu'un sujet sur lequel on travaille, hein, c'est un de nos axes de développement, avec effectivement basé sur les sujets dont parlait Florian. Enfin, autour de tout ça, il y a de la signature électronique. Ce qui est important, dans la réglementation, on va retrouver le Data Act pour une certaine partie, mais on va retrouver surtout IEDAS, qui est un volet extrêmement important pour pouvoir être autorisé sur ces sujets-là. Et ce qui est important aussi sur le volet, c'est que ces technologies permettent à la fois de vérifier des credentials d'identité et pas uniquement votre identité régalienne, mais également des attributs d'identité dont vous avez besoin au quotidien. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, que vous ayez une question d'onboarding bancaire, d'un achat en ligne, y compris peut-être de vote, etc., vous n'avez pas besoin forcément à chaque fois déjà de transmettre les informations sur qui vous êtes, mais plutôt de répondre à des questions sur est-ce que, comme par hasard, est-ce que je suis majeur, est-ce que je suis, est-ce que j'ai tel âge, est-ce que j'ai tel niveau de revenu, etc. Et c'est ça que va permettre de faire la technologie Web3 le blockchain et crypto sur ces sujets d'identité. Et c'est ce qu'on développe côté Archipel, hein, qui est en production depuis 2020 et qui a des clients déjà déployés. Voilà.
D'accord. Donc, OK, wallet, e-wallet. Angelica, just turning to you again. So we're talking digital identity, and of course we're very fortunate since you also worked and your MEP was very active on setting up the European framework for e-identity. It's not quite yet finalized, I understand. There was a discussion, I believe, and still is, possibly about how can you ensure that there is the concept of self-sovereign identity is integrated into the thinking of the policymakers to make sure that solutions such as decentralized identification solutions also can continue to evolve and people can innovate in that space. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that debate is?
Yes, thanks a lot. And that was very interesting to hear about all of the technologies. Is indeed touching upon directly the European digital identity wallet that we're currently working on. and we're very close to finishing it as well. I'm not aware of how much people from the room know about the EU EID or EIDAS 2, but shortly, just to explain, it will come in a form of an app on the phone of all the citizens of or people living in the European Union. They would be able to request from the authorities their documents to be stored in the wallet. And they will be able to use this documents in order to access public services, but also private services. And one of the key added values of this wallet is the fact that it would be used all over Europe. So we would have a high degree of interoperability between the member states. Now, ideally, it would have been to have one wallet that functions all across the EU. Unfortunately, because we have a lot of member states, some of them already have some systems developed in place. They will capitalize on those to create their own wallets. So we will have each member state will create its own wallet, but we will, of course, ensure that we have all of these wallets communicate with each other and reach a high degree of interoperability. When it comes to the technology that is going to be used, the discussion was always to try to be technologically neutral. What we are trying to do in this proposal and in this legislation is to establish the main principles. So the principles like user being the one who has full control of the data, the one who is issuing the wallet will never have access or technical access to the content of a wallet. So whoever is providing the app will never have a possibility to see the transactions that are being done by the user or what type of documents they have stored in this wallet. So in the end, the zero knowledge proof was mentioned before in the room. It's something that we would highly encourage. So the idea is to have this possibility of users to be in full control, to have a high degree of privacy, but at the same time, it would be up to the member states to decide what type of technology they use. And this is why I think this discussion in the panel today was very useful, because different technologies were presented and they're all aiming to achieve the same goal, which is the idea of self-sovereign identity and full control of a user and high degree of privacy and security. So technologies will develop more in time. And now the idea would be for those who are developing these solutions, because they can be also developed by private entities and be embraced by the government. The idea would be for those who are issuing it to make sure that they are finding the best way forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So the main message, I guess, is an enabling framework for people to go off and innovate, and that sounds great. I want to turn to the risks, and it can be about identity or about markets more broadly. I was a subject a month and a half ago of identity theft. And some really horrible things happen. And so I'm very keen to discuss this personally as well, but it's also massive concerns of policymakers, clearly, with all that amount of data that is going around. Is clearly there are existing, but also maybe more intense existing risks, maybe new risks in the area of whether it's anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, cybersecurity. I mentioned, ID fraud, you name it, market abuse. So, Chen, maybe we can start with you. And what's your assessment of that kind of new risk landscape? And are you seeing the private sector mobilize to put solutions in place to really reassure people and politicians around these developments?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think, first of all, I think it's really important to recognize that every time a big revolution happens, every time humanity goes through a big revolution, it brings with it a ton of advantages, but oftentimes we ignore the risks. The Industrial Revolution brought in productivity, but terrible, terrible labor rights that were only, kind of corrected 100 years in delay. The Information Revolution and, now the Data Revolution, creates a ton of opportunity for, innovation, but at the same time brings a lot of risks. And it seems to me like this time it's going to be addressed sooner rather than 100 years later, which is really positive thanks to the amazing work by so many companies and, of course, our regulatory partners. I think on a macro level, there's it's a really, crypto, Web3, decentralized finance are a really exciting opportunity to rethink how we deal with data because they introduce different ways to approach data. Our mission at Solidus, and by the way, for those who are not familiar with us, Citigroup named Solidus Labs category definer about a year ago for crypto market surveillance, which of course immediately raises questions to do with data. But we specifically specialize, what market surveillance means is preventing market manipulation and abuse. Things like wash trading, like insider trading that Mark Oberger mentioned in relation to NFTs earlier. That's our specialty. And I'll try to kind of summarize the way we see the opportunity in two different directions. First of all, there's an amazing opportunity to utilize distributed ledgers, blockchain, to just find more efficient ways to use data in order to share identity, prove identity, et cetera. And I think a lot of my colleagues are doing incredible work on that front. I'm really sorry to hear about your identity theft. It has happened to me as well. And I'll also mention that about 6 months ago, I lost my passport. I'm actually keeping it in my pocket now and not at the hotel because it just disappeared from the hotel room. And suddenly, it's just amazing to suddenly realize how much you're dependent on a piece of paper that is really hard to reproduce. I became the most privileged undocumented immigrant in America in a day. And just thinking about the opportunities of having that data digitally and everything that's been discussed in terms of technological solutions is incredible. So there's a real opportunity to just find better, more efficient ways to prove identity in a way that doesn't necessarily force revealing all the data. And I think folks here spoke to it really well. There's also a huge opportunity to use the way blockchains work, whether it's in the context of capital markets and in the longer term, in the context of the grand vision of Web3, to become much more efficient in understanding risk based on data and less reliant on identity. The way I think about it, financial risk monitoring, essentially what compliance, what decides whether people can or cannot use financial services, has very much over the years acted like a bouncer. The guy or person who stands at the entrance to a bar and kind of checks people out when they try to go in and decide based on very basic things, in finance, it's binary checks, right? Whether they fit a certain profile or not. Obviously, it's for a good reason. It's to prevent crime and a lot of the illicit behaviors you've mentioned, Bertie. But it also means that a lot of people stay out. And once you keep a lot of people out of, a financial service or a club, for that matter, it's much easier to feel confident that there's less crime happening inside. Crime still happens, as we know, in traditional finance as well, not just in crypto and decentralized finance. And the response is usually to stop people at the exit then and punish them, to deter folks. In our work, in order to effectively monitor things like insider trading in digital asset markets, we just published a report specifically on insider trading on DEXs, and we found that over half of centralized exchange-listed tokens, so tokens that were listed on some of the largest platforms in the world, over half of them were accompanied by intense evidence of insider trading. And I really connected to what Mark said this morning because, it's just unfair, it's inefficient, and it's not a testament for a market or a service that will last for very long. But one of the most interesting things to me about our report we published is that it was based mostly on public data. Meaning, you can, in a world where a lot of the data is on a blockchain, you can, without looking at private data, understand problematic behavior. And the moment you understand it, without necessarily knowing the identity, you can decide in a much more surgical way when you need to actually intervene, whether you're a platform trying to prevent crime, or a market trying to prevent crime, or whether you're a regulator. Meaning, if I kind of summarize it, there's a very powerful opportunity to utilize the Web3 revolution, the crypto revolution, the DeFi revolution, in order to transition from, over time, gradually in a safe way from an identity-based risk approach to a behavioral-based risk approach. And I'll summarize by giving a quick allegory. I'm sorry, I know I get very excited about these things, so I can talk for very long. But I think that the way we're going, ultimately, we could start thinking about financial services in a way similar to other public infrastructure, like roads. Yes, to get on a road, you need to go through basic training, you get a license, but no one checks you in and out every time you use the road. Instead, there's a level of monitoring, and if someone misbehaves, you catch it right away and you remove them. And I can imagine a world where financial services operate similarly, a much more open finance, accessible, where people own their data, but there's an ability through very sophisticated risk monitoring like ours and other companies that work in the field to intervene when needed.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we've got a couple of minutes left. I'd love to hear from Florian, from the solutions that also you do.
Ouais, tu mentionnais le vol d'identité. Nous, aujourd'hui, notre métier, c'est finalement de parler avec des projets, réellement comprendre la data qu'ils ont réellement besoin d'obtenir. Et en fait, quand on parle de l'identité, là, évidemment, moi, je viens avec la casquette Synaps, donc KYC, réglementation. Mais en fait, l'identité est beaucoup plus large que ça. Et avec Anima, du coup, nous, on a identifié, on va dire, 3 gros pools de projets. Et finalement, le premier pool, eux, ce qu'ils veulent, c'est simplement savoir qu'un utilisateur est unique. Ils ont besoin de rien savoir, de rien connaître d'autre sur cette personne, juste que moi, dans mon système, cet utilisateur est unique. Donc nous, on a développé ce qu'on appelle Proof of Personhood, qui va en fait permettre de vérifier que l'utilisateur est unique tout en gardant complètement privé, toute sa donnée reste privée, on n'a aucune idée de qui l'utilisateur est et on ne garde absolument rien sur lui, on va juste pouvoir dire qu'il est unique. Derrière, on va avoir les claims qui vont nous permettre donc de dire j'ai plus de 18 ans. Et après, également les plateformes qui sont régulées, où là, nous, on va pouvoir leur partager un KYC complètement compliant en simplement signant un message. Donc l'idée pour nous, c'est on ne devrait donner aux entreprises que l'extrême nécessité en termes de data. Il n'y a pas de raison de révéler plus que nécessaire. Et donc voilà, on a vraiment ces 3 gros pools où c'est notre métier finalement d'identifier ce dont nos clients ont réellement besoin et après de les accompagner pour ne récolter que ça. Ouais.
J'ai les gros yeux de Faustine, donc je vais être obligé de, vu que c'est ma cliente en plus, d'arrêter tout de suite. Merci à chacun. Merci Angelica. J'aurais adoré la question qu'on avait prévue sur l'impact de l'IA, sur le développement du Web3 aussi. Mais bon, ça sera pour la discussion autour d'un café. Et merci à chacun de vous encore. Et Angelica, thank you so much and hope the vote goes through.
Thank you very much. It did indeed. So,
it just did. Okay, well, you go live. Data has gone through. Okay, thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much as well.